the final argument that we'll talk about in this lesson on why we should support or why free trade may be best is actually called the theory of the second best. And the idea is that there may be some optimal policy that is superior to free trade, but this policy is politically impossible or unachievable. Okay? Which means that the best is something that we can't do. So we could say, the best, the top number one choice would be policy A. Okay? But we can't have policy A because of the political impossibility or the infeasibility of it. Okay? And we'll get into that a little bit more. And the idea is that the second best may be free trade, right? And the third best, something that we could actually achieve, would be policy B, okay? So the idea here is that if we were able to achieve any policy outcome we wanted, policy A is the best trade policy that we can possibly have. However, if it's impossible to achieve policy A, then the argument goes that the best thing might be free trade. Okay, and we can move this down to the third and say, if we can talk about if policy B is impossible, right, then free trade might be the third best option. But if we have two impossible options ahead of it, then free trade is the best of the relevant options. Okay, so the idea here is that if you want to think of it this way, if your favorite ice cream is vanilla, strawberry, and then chocolate, and if you go to an ice cream parlor that has strawberry and chocolate ice cream, it doesn't really matter that you like vanilla ice cream best. If you can't have it, your choices are among the strawberry or the chocolate, and so you pick strawberry. That's sort of the argument. Okay, if you can't have your favorite thing, then you have to have your second favorite. Okay, or you have to have the favorite thing among all the relevant things that you can have. And so the argument here is that the optimal policies, or any policies that would be superior to free trade, are politically impossible or unachievable, making free trade the best one that we can possibly get. Okay. Now, this is a weird argument if you think about it. It says that there's lots of things that are better than free trade, but we can't have them, which is a strange thing to think. Okay, but let's just think through sort of what's going on here. And so we'll come back to this and ignore the second supply curve that I drew, and we'll focus just on the blue, black, red, black shapes. If this was, let's say this is the US steel market, okay? If you're the United States steel industry, or if you work in the US steel industry, and you are facing stiff competition from China, let's say, and they're exporting steel to the US, or maybe there's currency manipulation or something going on that causes the US citizens to buy more Chinese steel than they would otherwise, well, you might argue and say, hey, this isn't right. We need to have some sort of a corrective policy in place, okay? And the argument goes that you, as the worker in the steel industry, would support a tariff on Chinese steel because it transfers this here from the consumer to you. So these are dollars here that would be captured by consumers, but could instead be captured by steel producers. Okay, so the idea is that domestic companies will lobby Congress or the president to get tariffs on their products. Okay? And so the idea again is that each individual company is going to have a strong incentive to do this because if they can successfully place a tariff, that's going to raise the price of foreign competition, meaning that domestic producers are free to raise their prices as well, and they can gain extra profits. Economists call this behavior rent seeking. Okay? But you can think of it as it being equivalent to trying to get or secure extra profits, okay, through government regulation. Okay. So what happens is lobbyists from these companies, in the hypothetical case that I presented, lobbyists in the steel industry will come to Washington, D.C., and they'll say something like, hey, we're facing really big competition from China in terms of steel. We can't compete with those people, or it's unfair in some way, is usually how they'll phrase it. We need to have some sort of a tariff put in place to correct for the unfairness of Chinese production and their currency manipulation. Okay, and Congress will say, oh my God, this is terrible. We need to do something. They pass a tariff, right? They'll usually sell it as protecting American jobs, and it certainly does, right? So remember, we had that many being produced domestically beforehand, and now we have this many. That's more jobs in the steel industry. Okay, and people are obsessed with having jobs, and so instead, people tend to focus on the number of jobs in the economy and not the volume of trade that happens for some reason, probably because, well, that's what we measure. Okay, and so people are obsessed with having jobs. This will promote jobs, that's true, but it makes consumers poorer, right? And it makes us poorer by the deadweight loss triangles and by the additional benefits as well. Okay, and so the argument goes that domestic companies will lobby Congress and the president to get tariffs on their products, thereby increasing their own profits. Okay. And so this is basically, or another way to think of it as, this is a special interest case. Case where special interests, people who are particularly interested in a certain industry, have a strong incentive to try to get additional benefits that they want to secure. Right? If this interests you, by the way, if this is an interesting topic, you should take, if your university offers such a course, you should take a public choice class. Okay, there's a great field that studies all of this stuff. It's called public choice, right? And you should go take a look at it. Okay, so the idea is that we can disperse costs. So we disperse costs among society and concentrate the benefits. Okay. Now, the clearest example of this, at least in the United States, is on the sugar industry. Okay, so I'm going to attempt to draw a rough map, and you'll see that my cartography skills are very poor. So let's see, the US looks kind of like this. Close enough, right? There's the United States minus Alaska and Hawaii. And here is Mexico and Latin America. Again, close enough for our purposes. And then Canada, I think, looks something like that. Okay, so we've got Canada, the US, and Mexico. Okay. Now, for some reason, if you think about it, it's a very strange thing that that sugar is more expensive in this area. right? So in this area right here, in this magical band, it should technically be all of America, close enough. All right, in this magical band right here, sugar is very expensive. So sugar is expensive. Okay, in fact, it's about 14 cents per pound more expensive. At least this was the last figure I saw, but it's been a while since I looked it up, so it's probably different by now. Okay, so sugar is, for some strange reason, about 14 cents per pound more expensive in the United States than it is in Mexico or Canada. As a result, right, Coke has sugar here, and it has sugar here, and here it has corn syrup. Okay, so why is it that in the U.S. sugar is so expensive? In fact, it's so expensive that Coca-Cola and Pepsi and every other soda manufacturer uses corn syrup in the US, but they use sugar in Canada and Mexico. Okay, well, the idea is that there are basically 4 major sugar producers in the US who lobby Congress to have a tariff and a quota, which we'll talk about in a future video, on sugar. Okay, and in doing so, not only a certain amount of sugar is allowed to flow from Mexico to the U.S., and only a certain amount is to flow. Well, I guess it's probably not being grown in Canada, but if it were, only a certain amount would be allowed to be imported from Canada into the U.S. Okay, it restricts the amount of sugar that the U.S. industry can get, or the U.S. market can get from foreign competition, right? And as a result, sugar is more expensive. Now, these 4 major sugar producers, they get 14 cents more per pound in the U.S. than they would otherwise, right? Now, 14 cents is not that big of a number. You know, I think I've got 14 cents just sitting around here. In fact, here, let me see, right? 1 dime, 2, 3, and here's 14 cents, right? They get 14 cents more, per pound of sugar that they sell. But they're selling millions and millions of pounds of sugar, which equates to millions and millions of 14 cents, right? Which is a lot of money. Now, you and I, we probably buy, let's say, 5 pounds of sugar per year. So it's costing us, 70 cents a year. And that's about it, right? Which is barely enough to notice and barely enough to be worth our time thinking about, right? So what happens is the cost of the higher sugar is dispersed across all of us as consumers, and it's concentrated on just these 4, big sugar companies in the U.S. Okay, so the idea here is that this is purely a rent-seeking or a profit-seeking exercise, and that what it's trying to do is basically make U.S. consumers pay more money. Now, this is contentious. People disagree with what I've just said, and that's fine. It's perfectly valid. I'm not trying to present it as 100%. This is purely what these people are doing. Okay, and so to try to argue that that free trade is the second best, to return to our basic idea, okay, what we can look at is the growth rate, or the amount of regulations in the U.S. today compared to, let's say, 1975. Okay, so the idea is that these policies, policy A and policy B, these are going to require regulations on U.S. consumers, right, or U.S. industry, or U.S. Production, or the U.S. economy. Okay, so it seems to me like we could have some sensible regulations in place, and that there probably are some things that need to be regulated and things that maybe don't need to be regulated. Okay, and the question becomes, can we achieve a sensible thing? Well, what we can look at is the growth rate of regulations over time. Okay, so from 1975, the Code of Federal Regulations had 71,224 pages in it, which seems pretty high, but maybe that's reflecting some sort of complexity of the world. And since then, in 2012, the latest data that we have available, or that I have available rather, the total number of pages has grown to 174,545. So it's more than doubled. In fact, it's grown by 100,000 pages. It seems to me like it's unlikely that the world has gotten so much more complicated since 1975 as to require an extra 103,000 pages to regulate it. Okay, so what's going on in these regulations? The argument here is that there are things just like the sugar industry going on that are basically different lobbying groups or different companies trying to secure protections from foreign producers for themselves so that they can get some of these 14 cents or an analogous 14 cents for their industries as well. Okay, so those are the three main arguments for free trade or against having tariffs and quotas. Okay, in the next lesson, we'll go over the arguments sort of against these things and against these assumptions. But before I turn it over to that, I want to make note that even people who are staunchly against free trade, they'll agree with this theory of the second best argument. It's a very powerful argument. It's one that's tough to argue against, but we'll see some of the recent attempts to argue against it in the next lesson.